Welcome to your introduction to film noir. Film noir refers to a type of film that is characterized by a very pessimistic, fatalistic, and menacing mood, so a very dark film. The term was originally applied by a group of French critics when they were speaking of the American thriller or detective films that were made during a 10-year period from 1944 to 1954. Some film noir directors include Orson Welles, Fritz Lang, and Billy Wilder. In these types of films, there are certain characters that emerge. The first character, the investigator, is the detective character, and he's usually a man who is very honest, although at times he kind of walks a line between being very honest and bending the law a bit. The criminal in these stories is usually guilty of murder. Murder is the most popular crime in this type of film. And in this type of film, there are generally two female characters. One is the femme fatale, which literally means deadly woman. And this character is very, very beautiful, but also very, very bad, and often leads the male characters down a dark path, sometimes to their deaths. The second female character is not quite as beautiful as the first character. She's not ugly, but she's not as stunning. Sort of plain looking, but also very good at heart. These films are actually based on a type of fiction that came about in the early 20th century, and it was called pulp fiction. I'm sure you're familiar with that phrase. Pulp fiction actually refers to a type of magazine that was published in the early 20th century. And it was published on very, very cheap paper, which was called pulp, hence the term pulp fiction. And so it was published probably between the 1930s and the 1940s, this type of magazine. Very low priced, wildly popular with the public. And there were two types of pulp fiction. One was the hard-boiled detective story, and the other was the science fiction story. They almost look like comic books, these magazines. And a lot of pulp fiction's writers became very, very successful and popular, and they went on to become very popular and talented novelists. So writers like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett were two of those writers who initially wrote pulp fiction but became successful novelists. In film noir, the location is usually in a big city. And the story involves stolen money or stolen valuables most of the time. The plot is generally complicated and somewhat far-fetched, so not totally believable, kind of out there, intricate. In this type of film, there are usually a lot of flashbacks, and the characters are somewhat obsessed with some event in the past. In this type of film, the characters are often seen smoking heavily and drinking hard liquor. And in many cases, the scene will be, there'll be just a lot of smoke. It will be a smoke-filled room. The director in film noir is usually a European emigre. That would be a person who has been compelled to leave his or her country because of political reasons. And that is why the films take on such a dark tone, because these directors are usually coming from a very dark and difficult past. In this type of film, the lighting is dark and oppressive. The dialogue is very artistic, artful, but fast-paced, choppy, and poetic. Again, the directors of these films have a bleak view of humanity, so that is what you're going to see oftentimes thematically in these films, is a very, very dark, bleak view of human nature. Composition refers to the positioning of characters and objects in a scene. And during the 1930s, there were a set of codes that came up called the Hays Code, and they were enforced by the president of the Motion Picture Association. During this time period, there was no rating for films. So you didn't have films that were rated G. There was no rating system. There was no rated G, PG, PG-13, R, etc. So instead, the president of the Motion Picture Association enacted a series of codes called the Hays Codes. And these codes were aimed at keeping films from becoming immoral. And so you couldn't have nudity, and you couldn't have graphic violence, and you couldn't have bad language in these types of films. So in order to heighten the dramatic effect of these films, directors had to use composition, the positioning of characters, focus, close-ups, and manipulating lighting in order to create the effects that you might get if you were able to incorporate those other elements. So in this type of film, you're going to see things like mirrors and reflections to heighten the drama and the suspense. The Venetian blind effect is a hugely popular effect in these types of films. So oftentimes you will see a character, standing in front of a window, and the shadows from the Venetian blinds make that character appear trapped. Or as if he or she is in jail. There is a lot of smoke, rain, and fog in these pictures as well. These are just some vintage posters of some films that would be characterized as film noir. The first one for the Maltese Falcon, you can see, is very dramatic. It's very, exaggerated. He's got two guns there. And there's often, with these types of posters, you're going to see some kind of tagline. So in this case, it's a story as explosive as his blazing automatics. And then The Postman Always Rings Twice, another film noir. Their love was a flame that destroyed. That would be the tagline for that. And finally, this is a poster for the film we're going to be watching, which is called Double Indemnity. And the tagline for this one is, "You can't kiss away a murder." Don't forget to take good notes and expect a quiz in class.